Before we begin our journey into the shadows, a crucial disclaimer must be heard. The story you are about to hear is a tapestry woven from countless threads: court documents, declassified government reports, journalistic investigations, and historical accounts. It is presented not to glorify, but to educate. Our sole purpose is to lay the intricate and often terrifying truth before you, allowing you to understand the full scope of a reality that once was. This is the story of power, ambition, and the quiet architect of an empire built on white dust. If you are ready to delve into the depths of one of history's most sophisticated criminal enterprises, then listen closely. And if you find yourself captivated by tales of the underworld's most calculated minds, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your engagement helps us continue our mission to bring these complex narratives to light. Now, let us begin. The name Cali evokes images of salsa music, of sun-drenched plazas and the warm, tropical air of Colombia's southwestern heartland. It is a city of joy, of culture, of life. But for 2 decades, from the 1970s deep into the 1990s, this same city served as the global headquarters for an enterprise so vast, so ruthlessly efficient, and so deeply embedded in the fabric of society that it rivaled, and for a time even surpassed, the infamous Medellin cartel in its reach and influence. This was the Cali Cartel, and at its helm, not as a flamboyant, gun-toting king, but as its quiet, bespectacled, and impeccably dressed chief executive sat Gilberto Rodríguez Orejuela. He was not called the Lord of the Cali Cartel or the Violent Godfather. His moniker, bestowed upon him by law enforcement and his own subordinates, was El Legidracista, the chess player. This name was a perfect encapsulation of his essence. He did not fight his battles in the streets with bullets. He waged his wars in quiet rooms, thinking 10 moves ahead, sacrificing pawns to protect his king, and always planning for an endgame of absolute dominance. His game board was the entire globe, and his pieces were politicians, policemen, bankers, and businessmen. His weapon of choice was not a gun, but a ledger. His product, however, was a powder that would addict millions and drench his nation in blood cocaine. To understand Gilberto is to understand that the most dangerous criminals are not those who shout their threats, but those who speak in whispers, whose violence is delegated, whose power is invisible until it is too late to resist. He was a man who believed that money, not terror, was the ultimate key to power, and for a long time, he was proven right. Gilberto Rodríguez Orejuela was born on January 30, 1939, in Maracuita, in the Tolima department of Colombia, a region known for its coffee and its rugged landscapes. He was not born into extreme poverty, nor into great wealth. His was a middle-class existence, one that offered a view of a respectable, conventional future. His father was a modestly successful pharmacist, and the family later moved to the city of Cali, a relocation that would define Gilberto's destiny. From a very young age, the contours of his character began to emerge. He was serious, studious, and possessed of a quiet intensity that set him apart from his more boisterous peers. He had an innate understanding of numbers, and a natural propensity for business, traits he initially applied to legitimate ventures. He worked as an errand boy for a local pharmacy, a seemingly humble job that taught him the fundamentals of supply, demand, and customer relations. But the streets of Cali in the 1950s and 60s were a university of a different kind. They were teeming with opportunity, both legal and illicit. The nascent drug trade, initially focused on marijuana, was beginning to bloom, and the ambitious young Gilberto saw a landscape far more lucrative than any pharmacy could ever offer. His first foray into the underworld was not with cocaine, but through a practice known as guinaldo. This involved stealing tombstones from cemeteries, polishing them to remove the inscriptions, and reselling them at a fraction of their original cost. A macabre but profitable business that demonstrated a cold, pragmatic disregard for sentimentality and a sharp eye for an untapped market. It was here he began to forge the connections that would shape his future, most importantly with a young, ambitious man named Jose Santa Cruz Londoyo, who would become one of his chief lieutenants and a cornerstone of the Cali Cartel. Together, they graduated from tombstones to petty crime, but Gilberto's mind was already working on a larger scale. He understood that real, lasting power did not come from street-level hustles, but from controlling a supply chain. The turning point, the moment the chessboard was truly set, came with the rise of a new commodity, cocaine. In the early 1970s, the demand for this pure, powerful stimulant began to explode in the United States. What was once a niche drug for the elite was becoming a mainstream symbol of decadence and energy. Gilberto, with his sharp business acumen, recognized this not as a passing trend, but as the industrial revolution of crime. He saw that the real money was not in small, time distribution, but in wholesale, in logistics, in building an empire that could move product on a scale never before imagined. He began to organize. He reached out to the chemists in the jungles of Peru and Bolivia who processed the coca paste. He established relationships with the pilots who were daring enough to fly small planes across treacherous routes. He started to build the architecture of a multinational corporation, one whose boardrooms were hidden in safe houses and whose stock was measured in kilos of white powder. This was the genesis of the Cali Cartel, and from its very inception, it bore the imprint of Gilberto Rodríguez Orejuela's unique philosophy: operate like a Fortune 500 company, maintain a low profile, bribe instead of bully, and above all, think long term. While Pablo Escobar in Medellin was making headlines with his brutal terrorism and flamboyant lifestyle, Gilberto was quietly, methodically building a machine that would eventually outlast and outperform Medellin in every way that mattered to a businessman: revenue, market share, and longevity. The rise of the Cali Cartel under Gilberto Rodríguez Orejuela's strategic guidance was a masterclass in corporate structuring disguised as criminal enterprise. While the Medellin cartel, under Pablo Escobar's volatile leadership, waged a literal war against the Colombian state, attracting the furious, undivided attention of American and Colombian authorities, Gilberto and his partners Notably, his brother Miguel and Jose Santa Cruz Londoño chose a different path, one of infiltration and symbiosis rather than confrontation. They understood that a state at war with you is an existential threat, but a state that you can purchase piece by piece is merely a business expense. This philosophy became the bedrock of their operations. Gilberto, the chess player, was meticulously positioning his pieces. He divided the cartel's functions into specialized, compartmentalized departments, each operating with a degree of autonomy that protected the core leadership. There was a transportation division, run by some of the most brilliant and daring pilots in the world, who devised complex routes through the Caribbean and later, sophisticated methods for shipping cocaine hidden within legitimate cargo through Mexican ports. A financial division, staffed by astute accountants and lawyers, managed the mind-boggling cash flow, pioneering methods of money laundering that would later be studied by international financial investigators. They invested in a vast network of legitimate businesses, pharmacies, a chain of drugstores called Drogas La Ribaja, car dealerships, radio stations, and even the beloved Cali-based football club, Amy Rica de Cali. These businesses were not just fronts. They were strategic assets. They provided a veneer of respectability, a means to recycle billions of dirty dollars into the clean Colombian economy, and a powerful tool for community influence. Owning a football club, in particular, was a stroke of genius. It made the Rodríguez Orejuela brothers local heroes, beloved philanthropists. Their names cheered in stadiums rather than whispered in fear. This was a public relations strategy Escobar could never have conceived. Gilberto's most brilliant and insidious innovation, however, was his systemic corruption apparatus. He established a dedicated department whose sole purpose was to identify, target, and bribe officials at every level of Colombian society. This wasn't haphazard bribery. It was a calculated investment. The cartel maintained elaborate databases, known as computables, which contained detailed dossiers on judges, police officers, politicians, military officials, and bureaucrats. These files noted their salaries, their family connections, their vices, their debts, and their price. When a law enforcement operation threatened them, the Cali Cartel often knew about it before the officers involved did. They didn't need to bomb the headquarters of the Departamento Administrativo de Seguridad, Colombia's intelligence agency. They simply paid the agents working inside to pass them information. This web of complicity was so vast that it became a parallel state, a Cali Cartel shadow government operating within the legitimate one. Their communication network was another testament to their sophistication. They developed an encrypted pager system and used complex codes in public payphones, making wiretaps nearly useless for years. Their distribution network was a marvel of logistics. While Medellin relied on flashy, high-risk speedboats and small planes, Cali established long-term, reliable partnerships with Mexican trafficking organizations, which would eventually evolve into the fearsome cartels of today to move multi-ton shipments across the U.S. border. Gilberto's focus was always on the bottom line and risk mitigation. He famously discouraged the use of violence unless it was absolutely necessary and strategically sound. A dead official was a problem that attracted more investigation. A bribed official was an asset. This preference for corruption over carnage earned the Cali Cartel the moniker, the Gentleman Cartel. In some circles, a dangerously misleading label that underestimated their capacity for ruthlessness when the board required it. When a threat needed to be eliminated, it was done with chilling efficiency, far from the public eye, making the victim simply disappear. This period throughout the 1980s was the cartel's golden age. At its peak, it was estimated that the Cali Cartel was responsible for controlling over 80% of the world's cocaine supply, generating a daily income that ran into the tens of millions of dollars. Gilberto Rodríguez Orejuela, the quiet pharmacist's son from Mariquita, had become a billionaire, a kingmaker, a ghost in the machine of global narcotics. His influence stretching from the jungles of Colombia to the nightclubs of Miami and the streets of New York, all while sitting calmly in his office in Cali. A chess player contemplating a board he seemed to completely control. The absolute zenith of the Cali Cartel's power arrived in the early 1990s, a period where Gilberto Rodríguez Orejuela's strategic vision seemed to have achieved an unassailable position. The downfall of Pablo Escobar in 1993, gunned down on a Medellin rooftop, was not just a victory for the state. It was a strategic masterstroke for the Cali Cartel. They had, in fact, played a crucial role in it. Gilberto and his brother Miguel, understanding that Escobar's war was bad for business and drew far too much heat, had quietly thrown their considerable resources and intelligence network behind a special police task known as the Bloque de Bitusqueda, or the Search Block. They provided tips, locations, and logistical support, effectively using the state as a pawn to eliminate their most volatile and attention-drawing competitor. With Escobar gone, the entire global cocaine wholesale market was theirs for the taking. They were no longer just a major player. They were the de facto monopoly, the opaque of cocaine, capable of influencing street prices across the United States and Europe from their offices in Colombia. This was the era of their greatest influence and audacity. The cartel's operations became even more brazen and efficient. They began using massive cargo freighters, shipping thousands of kilos at a time, hidden within legitimate goods like concrete posts, frozen vegetables, and even ceramic tiles. Their network of calatas, or hiding places for money, drugs, and weapons within Colombia and abroad became legendary, with compartments built into walls, underground vaults, and sophisticated safe houses that could evade the most thorough searches. Gilberto's personal life reflected this peak of power, though he maintained his disciplined, low-key facade. He lived not in a garish palace like Escobar's Hacienda en Apols, but in a luxurious, well-secured apartment in Cali's upscale neighborhood of Ciudad Jardín. He was a family man, seen at social events with his wife and children, always impeccably dressed in a business suit, looking every bit the successful corporate titan. He owned vast ranches, a collection of classic cars, and had interests in countless businesses, but his public persona was one of a wealthy, legitimate entrepreneur. He was a patron of the arts, a donor to charities, and the owner of America de Cali, a role that cemented his popularity among the city's working class. The team's victories on the field were, in a way, victories for the cartel, a symbol of Cali's dominance over Medellin, whose team, Atlético Nacional, was a rival. This veneer of legitimacy was so effective that for many Colombians, the Rodríguez Orejuela brothers were not monsters. They were modern-day Robin Hood figures, creating jobs, supporting the local economy, and putting their city on the map. However, beneath this calm surface, the empire was already showing the first, almost imperceptible, cracks. The very success that followed Escobar's death became their greatest vulnerability. The United States government, which had poured resources into the hunt for Escobar, now turned its full and undivided attention to Cali. The Cali Cartel was no longer in the shadow of a more flamboyant rival. They were now the number one target. American drug enforcement agents, working with a new, specialized unit within the Colombian police, began methodically targeting the cartel's structure. The first major blow was psychological. In 1995, the Colombian government, under intense American pressure, revoked the long-standing policy of prohibition on extraditing Colombian nationals to the United States. For Gilberto, this was a game-changing move. He could no longer rely on the familiar comforts of Colombian prisons or his network of corrupt officials if he were captured. He now faced the very real prospect of dying in a maximum security American prison, a checkmate he had not anticipated. The pressure intensified rapidly. High-level cartel members, the pawns in Gilberto's game, began to be captured one by one, and facing extradition, many began to flip, providing information to the authorities in exchange for leniency. The sophisticated communication system was slowly being deciphered. A massive raid in 1994, Operation Cornerstone, had already uncovered a treasure trove of financial records in the United States, exposing their money laundering networks. The net was closing, and the chess player found himself with fewer and fewer safe squares to move to. The calm, corporate facade began to fracture as the leadership was forced into a life on the run, moving between safe houses. Their once impregnable security apparatus strained to its breaking point by a relentless and increasingly sophisticated enemy that was finally learning to play the game his way. The year 1995 marked the beginning of the endgame, a period of relentless, crushing pressure where the meticulously constructed walls of the Cali Cartel began to crumble under the sustained assault of a now unified opposition. The United States Drug Enforcement Administration, the Central Intelligence Agency, and a newly emboldened and purged Colombian National Police Force launched a coordinated offensive dubbed Operation Cornerstone, a name that signified their intent to dismantle the very foundation of Gilberto's empire. The strategy was simple yet brutal. Instead of a direct and likely bloody assault on the leadership, they would methodically dismantle the cartel's infrastructure, piece by piece, until the kings had no board left to play on. The first major domino to fall was José Santa Cruz Londoño, one of the founding pillars of the organization. Santa Cruz, known for his volatile temper and his control over the New York distribution network, was tracked down and killed in a police shootout in Medellin in March 1996. His death was a devastating blow, not just for the loss of a key lieutenant, but for the signal it sent. The cartel's leadership was no longer untouchable. The noose was tightening with terrifying speed. Just a few months later, in June 1996, the cartel's formidable security chief and the mastermind behind their intelligence and corruption apparatus, Miguel Rodríguez Orejuela's right-hand man, was captured. This capture was a catastrophe for the brothers, as he possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of their entire operation, from the calatus to the computables, detailing their vast network of bribes. But the true prize, the king himself, remained elusive. Gilberto Rodríguez Orejuela, the chess player, was now a ghost, a fugitive in his own city. He abandoned his luxurious apartment in Ciudad Jardín and descended into a claustrophobic life of hiding, moving between a series of meticulously designed safe houses. His final refuge was a modest two-story brick house in the north of Cali, a location chosen for its sheer normality. It was here that the legend of Gilberto's cunning reached its peak. The safe house was a masterpiece of clandestine engineering. Behind a custom-built, hydraulically operated bookcase in the living room was a secret staircase leading to a cramped, soundproofed panic room barely larger than a closet. This was his world, a space with a single bed, a small toilet, an air conditioning unit, and a bank of telephones and communication equipment. He lived there for weeks, conducting his business, or what was left of it, from this subterranean coffin, while above him, the largest manhunt in Colombian history was underway. Thousands of police and soldiers flooded the streets of Cali, conducting house-to-house searches, setting up roadblocks, and offering massive rewards for information. The pressure was immense, and Gilberto, the master of patience, knew his time was running out. The corruption that had once protected him was now failing, as the Colombian government, under President Ernesto Samper, who was himself embroiled in a scandal involving Cali Cartel campaign contributions, was forced to take drastic action to salvage its international credibility. The end came not with a dramatic gunfight, but with a quiet, almost mundane surrender. On June 9, 1995, after a tip off from a captured cartel accountant, a special police unit surrounded the house. They knew he was inside, but finding him was another matter. For hours, they searched, tapping walls, moving furniture, until they finally discovered the mechanism for the bookcase. When they descended into the panic room, they found Gilberto Rodríguez Orejuela not as a defiant kingpin, but as a tired, 56-year-old man in a tracksuit, calmly awaiting his fate. There was no resistance. He was arrested without a single shot being fired. The chess player had been checkmated. His brother Miguel would be captured in a similarly engineered safe house just over a year later, in August 1996. The era of the Cali Cartel was, for all intents and purposes, over. The two architects were in custody, their empire in ruins, their vast fortune being seized by governments. and their legacy shifting from feared and respected kingpins to inmates facing the prospect of spending the rest of their lives behind bars. A final, stark move in a game they had once believed they were winning. The capture of Gilberto Rodríguez Orejuela and his brother Miguel did not mark the end of their story, but rather the beginning of a new, protracted chapter defined by legal battles, imprisonment, and the complex, often contentious, process of confronting their legacy from behind bars. Their initial confinement was not in the harsh, remote prisons reserved for common criminals or the brutal conditions endured by Pablo Escobar, but rather a reflection of the power and influence they still wielded, even as captives, under a controversial Colombian law, Law 81 of 1993, which was designed to encourage the surrender of drug traffickers by offering judicial benefits. The brothers negotiated a plea agreement. They agreed to confess their crimes, surrender a significant portion of their assets, though authorities always believed it was only a fraction of their true wealth, and submit to imprisonment within Colombia. In return, they received a capped sentence, and most critically, a guarantee that they would not be extradited to the United States. This was the chess player's final, calculated move from a position of weakness, securing a controlled, familiar environment where his wealth and remaining network could still provide a measure of comfort and influence. They were initially held in a specially designed, comfortable prison wing on the grounds of a military base in Palmyra, near Cali, a facility that critics derisively labeled La Catedral de Cali, a direct reference to Escobar's luxurious self-built prison. Here, they lived not as common inmates, but as white-collar criminals, with access to visitors, fine food, and business associates, allegedly continuing to manage their remaining legitimate enterprises, such as the Drogas La Rabaja pharmacy chain, and even, according to intelligence reports, directing the remnants of their criminal network. This arrangement, however, was untenable in the long run. Pressure from the United States, which viewed their confinement as a mockery of justice, and from a new Colombian administration seeking to demonstrate a tougher stance, forced a change. The brothers were moved to a more conventional, though still not maximum security, prison in Sica Mbita. It was here that the legal foundation of their deal began to crumble. The United States government, unsatisfied and armed with overwhelming evidence, intensified its efforts to have them extradited. For years, Gilberto and Miguel fought this through every legal avenue available, their teams of high-powered lawyers filing motion after motion, but the political landscape had shifted irrevocably. The era of negotiation was over. In 2004, the final blow fell. The Colombian Constitutional Court overturned the legal framework that had prohibited extradition, and the floodgates opened. One by one, the surviving Cali Cartel lieutenants were sent to the United States. The brothers themselves were finally extradited in 2005, a day they had fought for a decade to avoid. They were put on a DEA plane and flown to Florida to face the American justice system they had so successfully evaded for the entirety of their criminal careers. The trials that followed were a spectacle, the final public dismantling of their empire. The U.S. government presented a mountain of evidence, wiretapped conversations, financial records, and the testimony of former cartel members who had turned informants that laid bare the staggering scale of their operation. In 2006, Gilberto Rodríguez Orejuela stood before a federal judge in Miami and was sentenced to 30 years in a federal prison. His brother Miguel received an identical sentence. They were ordered to forfeit an unbelievable $2.1 billion, a sum that represented the estimated proceeds of their conspiracy, a number so vast it was almost abstract, a testament to the river of cocaine that had flowed from their hands to the streets of America. They were incarcerated in some of the most secure penitentiaries in the United States, designed to hold inmates who posed significant management problems. Their world shrunk to a concrete cell, a far cry from the panic rooms and corporate offices of Cali. The chess player's game was finally over. The board had been swept clean, his pieces captured, his kingdom dissolved. He was now simply inmate, a number in the system, facing the certainty that he would never again breathe the free air of his homeland. A life that had spanned the incredible journey from a humble pharmacy errand boy to the architect of a global criminal multinational, ending in the stark, unforgiving silence of a supermax prison, a quiet and profound defeat. The legacy of Gilberto Rodríguez Orejuela and the Cali Cartel is a complex and deeply embedded stain on the fabric of Colombia, a paradoxical tapestry woven with threads of immense economic influence, brutal realpolitik, and a lasting societal corrosion that continues to resonate decades later. To understand their full impact is to look beyond the sheer volume of cocaine they shipped and the billions of dollars they accumulated. It is to examine the profound and often insidious ways in which they reshaped the very institutions and psyche of a nation. Their most immediate and visible legacy was, of course, the further entrenchment of the narcotics economy into Colombia's political and social life. The Cali Cartel did not just bribe individuals, they systematized corruption, creating a blueprint for how criminal enterprise could paralyze a state from within. Their sophisticated computables, the databases of corruptible officials, revealed a chilling truth: that the integrity of the state had a price, and they were willing to pay it on an industrial scale. This erosion of public trust in government, the judiciary, and the police is a wound that has been slow to heal, creating a lingering cynicism among the populace. The cartel's influence reached the highest levels of power, most notoriously with the 1994 presidential campaign of Ernesto Samper, which was engulfed in the Proceso 8000 scandal after revelations that the Cali Cartel had contributed millions to his campaign. This scandal paralyzed the Colombian government for years, diverting its attention from crucial state matters to internal investigations and political survival, a period of institutional weakness that other criminal groups, including the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia and the National Liberation Army, would exploit to expand their own power. Yet, paradoxically, the cartel also left a mark of legitimate economic development in their home city of Cali. Their investments in real estate, commerce, and industry, while primarily mechanisms for money laundering, did create jobs and stimulate a local economic boom. They were modern day robber barons. Their philanthropic efforts, particularly through America de Cali, buying them a form of social legitimacy that Pablo Escobar's violent populism in Medellin never could. This has created a complicated and often conflicted memory of the brothers in the Val del Cauca region, where some still view them as benefactors who provided employment and lifted the city's profile. A dangerous nostalgia that whitewashes the source of their wealth and the violence that underpinned it on a global scale. The Cali Cartel's legacy is the professionalization and corporatization of the international drug trade. They were the first to truly operate as a multinational corporation, with a CEO, a board of directors, specialized departments, and a long-term business strategy. They demonstrated that the most successful criminal enterprises are those that emulate legitimate, big business, prioritizing market stability, risk management, and logistical efficiency over brute force. Their pioneering partnerships with Mexican trafficking organizations, initially hired as mere logistics contractors to move cocaine across the U.S. border, inadvertently laid the foundation for the rise of the even more violent and powerful Mexican cartels of the 21st century. The Mexicans, having learned the routes and mastered the distribution networks, eventually realized they didn't need the Colombians as suppliers. They could go directly to the source or diversify into other drugs, a shift in the global narcotics paradigm that the Cali Cartel's downfall directly enabled. Furthermore, their sophisticated money laundering techniques through chains of pharmacies, import-export businesses, and other front companies forced international financial institutions and governments to develop entirely new fields of forensic accounting and anti-money laundering laws, a permanent change in the global financial regulatory landscape. The relentless pursuit of the Cali Cartel by the United States also set a precedent for intense international law enforcement cooperation and the aggressive use of extradition as the primary weapon against transnational crime lords, a policy that continues to this day. In the end, the story of Gilberto Rodríguez Orejuela is a cautionary tale about the nature of power itself. He proved that a quiet, intelligent, and patient man could build an empire far more resilient and insidious than one built on loud terror. But his story also proves the limits of such power, the very forces he sought to co-opt. The global economic system and the international political order ultimately proved too vast and too complex to control indefinitely. His empire, for all its brilliance and sophistication, was built on a product that caused incalculable human suffering, addiction, and violence, both in the consuming nations and in his own. The final, unchangeable line on the balance sheet of his life is that he was a merchant of misery, a man who chose to amass a fortune by poisoning millions, and whose most enduring legacy is not the football trophies or the pharmacies, but the enduring scar of corruption and the tragic proof that crime, on a grand enough scale, can indeed change the world, but never for the better. to truly comprehend the psychological landscape of Gilberto Rodríguez Orejuela, the man behind the moniker of the chess player, is to venture into the mind of an individual for whom morality was not a compass, but a variable in a complex risk-reward calculation. A man whose entire worldview was filtered through the dispassionate lens of a corporate strategist. Unlike the archetypal narco-trafficker, driven by ego, a lust for recognition, or a violent temperament, Gilberto was motivated by a cold, almost serene, appreciation for order, structure, and the accumulation of influence. His was not a personality that craved the spotlight. In fact, he found it distasteful and strategically unsound. His power was not meant to be seen, only to be felt. In the politician who suddenly changed a vote, the judge who dismissed a case, the police commander who called off a raid. This desire for invisible control speaks to a deep-seated need to master his environment, to impose his own meticulous order upon the chaotic and often brutal world he had chosen to inhabit. He did not see himself as a gangster in his own mind. He was a visionary CEO, a captain of industry, whose product unfortunately happened to be illegal. This self-perception was the cornerstone of his psychology, allowing him to distance himself from the human carnage his business caused. The addiction, the overdose deaths, the street violence in American cities, the corruption of foreign officials. These were not moral failings to him, but simply externalities, the inevitable collateral damage of a vast and profitable global enterprise. No different than the pollution caused by a massive industrial plant. This cognitive dissonance was essential to his operation. It allowed him to be a loving family man, a doting father and husband, while simultaneously authorizing the murder of a business rival or the intimidation of a witness. The violence was never personal, it was operational, a necessary cost of doing business, a tool to be used with precision and only when the balance sheet demanded it. His partnership with his brother Miguel is also deeply revealing of his character. Miguel, often described as more volatile and directly hands-on with the enforcement arm of the cartel, served as Gilberto's shadow self. Miguel could handle the messy, brutal realities that Gilberto's corporate facade required, but wished to remain detached from. This division of labor allowed Gilberto to maintain his self-image as the clean executive, the strategist whose hands were never dirtied by the bloodier aspects of his trade. He was the brain, and Miguel, along with others like Jose Santa Cruz Londoño, were the fists. This dynamic illustrates a key aspect of Gilberto's psychology, a profound ability to delegate not just tasks, but also moral responsibility. His famous patience, his willingness to plan for years, to slowly and methodically corrupt an institution rather than storm it, points to a level of self-control that is almost superhuman. He was playing a game where a single moment of impulsivity could mean life imprisonment or death, and he understood this on a fundamental level. His greatest strength, this preternatural calm and foresight, however, also contained the seed of his ultimate downfall. His belief in the supremacy of money and strategy led him to underestimate the ideological resolve of his adversaries. particularly the United States government. He viewed the DEA and the American judicial system as just another set of players on the board, ones that could eventually be outmaneuvered or bought. He failed to fully grasp that for the Americans, this was not just a game of strategy, it was a moral crusade, an ideological war against a threat to their national fabric. He could not bribe the entire United States Congress. He could not corrupt the foundational principles of the American justice system. This miscalculation, this failure to understand an enemy that operated on a different value system than the one he had so thoroughly corrupted in his own country, was his fatal blind spot. In his final years, incarcerated in the sterile, controlled, and utterly inescapable environment of American supermax prison, one wonders if the chess player ever revisited his moves, if he ever conceded that for all his genius, he had misunderstood the nature of the game itself. He had spent a lifetime believing that every man and every institution had a price, only to find himself finally checkmated by a power that, for once, was not for sale. The silence of his cell must have been the loudest sound he had ever heard, a constant, deafening reminder that the board had been taken away, the pieces were gone, and the game was irrevocably over. The operational genius of the Cali Cartel, masterminded by Gilberto Rodríguez Orejuela, extended far beyond simple bribery and violence into a realm of logistical and financial innovation that would be the envy of any Fortune 500 company, creating a corporate empire with a global footprint that was both deeply hidden and staggeringly efficient. To grasp the scale of their operation is to understand that they were not merely drug traffickers. They were pioneers in global supply chain management, international finance, and corporate security, operating a business whose complexity was its primary defense mechanism. The journey of a kilogram of cocaine from a remote processing lab in the Peruvian jungle to a street corner in New York City was a marvel of modern logistics, broken down into discrete, compartmentalized stages, each managed by a specialized department that reported up a strict chain of command, but had little knowledge of the other components. A cellular structure designed to protect the core leadership. The procurement department managed relationships with coca growers and paste producers in Peru and Bolivia, ensuring a steady, high-quality supply of raw material. The transportation division, a fleet of boats, planes, and submarines, was a testament to their engineering prowess. They used fast-moving fast boats for small, high-priority shipments, but their real innovation was in commercial maritime transport. They purchased legitimate shipping containers and engineered sophisticated, hidden compartments within them, behind false walls of concrete posts, within loads of frozen broccoli, or inside legitimate consumer goods, knowing that inspecting every one of the millions of containers entering U.S. ports was an impossibility. They established front companies as import-export businesses to manage the paperwork and smooth the passage of these tainted containers through customs. Their air bridge was equally advanced. Using a network of clandestine airstrips in Colombia and remote locations in the Caribbean and Mexico, staffed by pilots who were paid exorbitant salaries to fly treacherous, radar-evading routes. Once the cocaine reached Mexico, their partners, who would later evolve into the cartels of today, handled the final, most dangerous leg across the U.S. border. The financial arm of the cartel was perhaps Gilberto's most brilliant creation, a system for moving and cleaning billions of dollars that baffled authorities for years. The sheer volume of cash generated in the United States was unimaginable. Literally tons of low-denomination bills that had to be collected, counted, and transported. They used a system called the black market peso exchange, a complex, multi-step process that allowed them to essentially launder money without it ever physically leaving the Americas. They would sell their dirty US dollars at a discount to Colombian brokers who needed dollars to pay for legitimate imports into Colombia, like televisions, appliances, or chemicals. These brokers would then use the cartel's cash in the US to pay the American exporters, and the cartel would receive clean pesos in Colombia from the broker's clients. It was a perfect, self-contained loop that turned the proceeds of crime into legitimate capital for investment in their vast network of businesses in Colombia, from the Drogas La Rabaja pharmacy chain to radio stations, real estate developments, and the América de Cali football club. Their communication network was a fortress of its own. Before the ubiquity of digital encryption, they relied on a system of encrypted pagers and a complex code system used on public payphones, changing codes daily to prevent interception. They maintained elaborate databases, not just on corrupt officials, but on their own employees, their routes, their safe houses, and their financial transactions. This corporate structure allowed for a level of resilience that the more personality-driven Medellin cartel lacked. When a cell was busted, it could be amputated without killing the entire organism. The cartel could suffer significant losses, even the capture of mid-level managers, and continue to function almost autonomously. This bureaucratic, almost mundane approach to crime is what made them so formidable and so difficult to dismantle. They weren't a gang. They were a conglomerate. Gilberto Rodríguez Orejuela's office was his command center, but it looked less like a gangster's den and more like a corporate headquarters, with flowcharts, financial statements, and logistical maps. He managed a workforce of thousands, from chemists and pilots to accountants and lawyers, all contributing to the single goal of moving product and maximizing profit. This cold, corporate efficiency is the most enduring and chilling aspect of their legacy. The proof that the greatest threats to global order are not always the chaotic forces of destruction, but sometimes the quiet, orderly, and relentlessly efficient forces of an immoral enterprise that has learned to wear the mask of legitimacy while its hands conduct a symphony of global corruption and addiction on a scale the world had never before seen. The inevitable and precipitous downfall of the Cali Cartel, once it began, was a masterclass in applied, relentless pressure. A multi-pronged offensive that systematically dismantled Gilberto Rodríguez Orejuela's empire by attacking its perceived strengths and exploiting its hidden vulnerabilities. The American and Colombian strategy evolved from one of brute force to one of surgical precision, targeting the very elements that had made the cartel so resilient: its financial infrastructure, its communication networks, and the illusion of its invincibility. The initial cracks, which appeared as mere hairline fractures in the mid-1990s, rapidly widened into catastrophic failures. The first and most critical vulnerability was human. The cartel's compartmentalized structure, while excellent for operational security, began to work against it as soon as the first high-value targets were captured. Faced with the terrifying prospect of extradition to the United States and life in an American supermax prison, a fate considered far worse than a comfortable, corrupt Colombian jail, key members of the organization began to break. These were not street-level enforcers, but accountants, lawyers, and mid-level managers. The very people who understood the intricate workings of the financial and logistical machines. They provided investigators with the Rosetta Stone to decode the cartel's operations, the locations of Calitas, the names in the computables, the codes for the pagers, and the complex pathways of the black market peso exchange. This insider information was devastating. Operation Cornerstone, a massive multi-year investigation led by the DEA, began to follow the money with an unprecedented level of detail. They infiltrated the financial networks, tracking wire transfers, identifying front companies, and seizing assets with a new level of effectiveness. The cartel's greatest strength, its immense laundered wealth, suddenly became a liability, a digital trail that led directly back to its leaders. The communication network, once an impenetrable fortress, was breached. American intelligence agencies, with their vast technological resources, eventually cracked the encryption on the cartel's pager system, turning their primary tool of coordination into a live feed for law enforcement. Every message sent between cartel members about a shipment, a payment, or a meeting was now potentially being read by the very agents hunting them. This forced the leadership, including Gilberto and Miguel, to abandon their established protocols and resort to riskier, more primitive methods of communication, increasing their exposure. The political landscape in Colombia also shifted seismically. The Proceso 8 scandal, which revealed the cartel's infiltration of the highest levels of government, created a political firestorm that President Ernesto Samper could only survive by taking an aggressively anti-cartel stance to prove his administration's legitimacy. This meant purging corrupted officials from the police and judiciary, effectively cutting off the cartel's eyes, ears, and protective shield within the state. The safe havens they had so carefully cultivated were disappearing. The manhunt itself became an overwhelming physical presence. The streets of Cali were flooded with over 1,000 specially trained police officers, a force so large and so persistent that it choked the city. They conducted tens of thousands of random stop and searches, set up countless vehicle checkpoints, and offered massive rewards for information, turning the population into a network of potential informants. The psychological pressure on the leadership was immense. Gilberto, the master of calm calculation, was forced into a frantic, nomadic existence, moving between increasingly claustrophobic safe houses, his world shrinking to a few square meters. The empire that had once spanned continents was now reduced to the dimensions of a panic room. The final, decisive blows were the captures themselves. The arrest of Gilberto in his ingeniously hidden bunker was not just the capture of a man. It was the symbolic capture of an idea. The idea that intelligence and money could forever insulate a criminal from justice. The subsequent capture of his brother, Miguel, confirmed that the entire structure had collapsed. The king and the heir were both in check. The extradition to the United States was the final, absolute confirmation of their defeat. It removed them from the familiar terrain of Colombia, where their wealth and influence still held some residual power, and placed them in a system that was utterly impervious to their corruption, a system whose only goal was to bury them in a concrete tomb for the rest of their natural lives. The downfall of the Cali Cartel was not a single event, but a cascade of failures, a demonstration that no criminal enterprise, no matter how sophisticated, can ultimately withstand the focused and sustained might of determined state powers. Once those powers finally decide to coordinate their efforts and learn to fight the war on the criminal's own terms of finance, intelligence, and patience. The story of Gilberto Rodríguez Orejuela, the chess player of Cali, does not end with the clang of a prison cell door. In the United States, instead, it resolves into a lingering, complex echo that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, crime, and the very nature of evil in the modern world. His life serves as a permanent case study, a dark lesson in the potential for intelligence and discipline to be perverted in the pursuit of ultimate, a moral power. The final years of his life were spent in the stark, monotonous environment of American federal custody, a world away from the sun-drenched plazas of Cali and the hushed, powerful offices from which he once directed his global enterprise. He became a ghost in the American penal system, an old man serving a sentence that would assuredly see him die behind bars, his once sharp mind likely fixated on the moves he could no longer make, the empire that had turned to dust. His brother Miguel shared this fate, the two architects living out their days in a cage of their own making, a poetic, if grim, justice for the countless lives shattered by their product. But the true conclusion of this saga is not merely the personal fate of its protagonist. It is the assessment of the vacuum he left behind and the indelible mark he stamped upon history. The dismantling of the Cali Cartel did not, as some had hoped, signal the end of the global cocaine trade. In nature, as in the world of illicit enterprise, a vacuum abhors itself. The sophisticated distribution networks they had built, particularly the partnerships with Mexican traffickers, were simply inherited and refined by their former contractors. The Mexican cartels, having learned the logistics and mastered the routes, seized control of the entire supply chain, evolving into the even more fragmented, territorial, and brutally violent organizations that plague Mexico and supply the world today. While the country has made heroic strides in restoring security and legitimacy to its government, the shadow of the narcocracy they built in the 1980s and 90s is long, a reminder of how fragile democratic institutions can be when faced with the corrosive power of virtually unlimited illicit wealth. The story of Gilberto Rodríguez Orejuela is ultimately a story of a paradox. He was a man of order who created chaos, a man of family who destroyed countless families, a quiet intellectual whose actions resonated with the force of a bomb. He demonstrated that the most formidable criminal is not the one who rules through fear, but the one who rules through structure, who understands that the most effective prison is not one made of bars, but one made of economic dependency and institutional complicity, a prison he built for an entire nation. His life forces us to ask a difficult question: which is more dangerous to society? The violent revolutionary who seeks to tear down the state, or the quiet corporatist who seeks to quietly purchase it and run it as a subsidiary of his own ambition? The chess player's game is finally over. The board has been put away, but the lessons of his life, the chilling efficiency of his methods, and the stark warning his story represents remain, a permanent fixture in the annals of crime. It is a story that needed to be told, not to celebrate, but to educate and to warn. We have journeyed together through the rise, reign, and fall of a criminal mastermind. And if this deep dive into the shadows has held your attention, if it has provided you with a clearer understanding of this complex chapter in history, then we have achieved our goal. The pursuit of truth, no matter how dark, is a vital endeavor. If you believe in this mission, please help us continue it. Your support is the cornerstone of this channel. Show it by liking this video, sharing it with others who are fascinated by the intricate stories of history's most powerful figures, and most importantly, by subscribing to the channel and clicking the notification bell. Your engagement is what allows us to continue unearthing these complex narratives and bringing them to you. Thank you for listening. Until our next journey into the pages of history, stay curious,